So we're going to move on now to the question and answer session, and I'm going to sort of open for questions in the chat. I'm going to be looking at that on the side. And in the meantime, I think while people are formulating their questions, I mean, I have some questions of my own, and I think I would actually maybe pose this to both Alex and to Joelle. I think one of the things that Seong-Hoon has made a very strong case for is, and I think Ari as well, the longitudinal data aspect. So, both of you have presented data that effectively uses a cross-section and in some sense doesn't sort of exploit the full nature of the panel. Although I think both of you also have made a very strong point that it does connect, being able to sort of connect to data from various different sources, pull up this all together is actually really, really useful. So perhaps, getting information from various waves and stitching that together is helpful in terms of being very efficient. But how does, for example, the idea that we could use longitudinal data maybe enrich the research question? So Alex, since you just finished speaking, maybe I'll go to Joelle first. Joelle, how do you think actually, with a study like yours where you have the financial literacy information and then you have, ElderShield, but we also have a lot of policy changes around ElderShield lately. How do you think or envision that the longitudinal aspect of the panel could play a role?
Right. I think from a public policy angle, this kind of panel and high frequency data would be really useful because as you've just pointed out, this policies evolve over time, and having this longitudinal data would allow us to kind of keep track of some of these, whatever we are measuring, be it long-term care insurance demand at some point in time, or maybe other kinds of financial product holdings. It allows us to kind of keep track and of the changes across time. And certainly demand would change across time. And I'm glad that you brought up also this change in this ElderShield program. In fact, just after this voluntary LTCI scheme, so in 2018, in 2020, although talks began in 2018, the government in Singapore actually decided to reform the LTCI program in Singapore from a voluntary insurance purchase to a mandatory LTCI purchase. So imagine if we did not have this panel data that, this SLP that started back in 2015, we would never have gotten hold of, these consumers' demand at that point in time. Because now, if we had fielded the question now, the scheme is, the ElderShield is even no longer in existence. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's great. I think, it would be actually really interesting if you could look at people who chose not to have it and then were enrolled in it on a mandatory basis, and maybe try to find some way to look at positive and negative welfare gains actually around mandatory introduction of LTCI. That would be super fascinating. Alex, I'm going to give you the floor for a little bit, and then I'm going to turn to Ari, who raised his hand, and then the question in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much. So I've got two responses. One is that beyond the specific problem that I was talking about today, we have used the fact that we've got longitudinal, the ability to collect longitudinal data to look at, over the course of the pandemic, how the number of contacts that people were reporting changed at different stages of the pandemic. So yes, I see the utility of that for sure. But if I come back to the hidden populations question, I mean, we were fielding a 20-minute long survey, and there were quite a lot of additional questions that we asked around about like their attitudes towards the law which criminalizes gay sex, for example, or their stigmatizing views towards the high-risk populations. And I think that actually the majority of the relevant questions that we would want to be able to ask, we were able to ask within that one sitting. Therefore, for that kind of a study, it's not clear to me that having the longitudinal aspect is actually going to be beneficial.
Okay, terrific. I'm going to move to Ari. Ari?
Yeah, so this is about the Singapore Life Panel. So it's terrific to be corrected so quickly. I claimed earlier on that there were two longitudinal probability-based internet panels, but at least there are three. Of course, I knew about the Singapore Life Panel, but I have to admit, I didn't really know much beyond that. And so just seeing that you collect this enormous wealth of longitudinal data is just fantastic. I Googled a little bit, so I tried to get some more information. So, so the question, do you actually make your data available to the research community at large? I didn't really see anything that would, for example, allow me to download the data. And a somewhat related or follow-up question is that, so gradually, more of these panels spring up in different places. And I think one of the powers that we have is also we can do a lot more quick internationally comparative research. And I think this would be a fantastic opportunity to do this across more countries and learn more quickly, for example, how policies work out during a pandemic or during any other event. So that's sort of, I guess, a potential that I would really think would be great if we could pursue that.
Shall I answer to this question? First of all, it's a very nice meeting to meet you. You never acknowledge us as a grandchild, but I always think of SAP as a grandchild of your project Dutch panel. So as the name suggested, we are directly affected by the American Life panel. We try to copy what was there in the American Life panel, and which was your kind of a brainchild as well. So I have almost respect for your work and your service and so on. I just want to acknowledge that. And yeah, it would be really nice to have some form of international collaboration. We are very much open, and we are open to the research community. We are so far selective about who can have access to the data yet, but it doesn't mean that you cannot have access to it after the internal review of the proposed research. We are happy to work together with external research, and we are already doing so with many other research organizations outside Singapore, actually. So yes, I think it would be really nice if we can further collaborate on joint project or something like that with the Understanding American Social Study, because it's pretty much the same structure in a way, right? Yeah.
No, great, thanks.
Yeah, terrific. And I would say that, truly it's an amazing resource just in terms of the size and scale of the data. I think it's really sort of, if I can say so, I think for older people, for such a small population that we have, the sample size of the SLP is really really remarkable. So
I think of it as a kind of mini census in that sense.
Yeah.
Because in Singapore, we have about 3 million local population, excluding foreigners, and our survey is about 8,000 people within 55 and 75. So it's like 0.3%, 0.4% of the population in that age range.
Yeah, but that actually leads us very nicely, I think, to the next question. And I think you already alluded to this in actually your presentation, and you talked about how some of it is online and some of it is assisted. I mean, and we also know that the Singapore population, which I think is so fascinating, has just a very sharp educational, health, and other type of well-being gradients across cohorts, right? Because our country is so young that actually at the older end of the age range, we have a vastly different population just in terms of its demographic makeup, its educational qualification, and then its lifetime experience and norms, then to the young old. So our old and our young old actually are very dramatically different. So I think Chirantan, Turakia, even though we are a very highly digitalized and connected country, there remain these very sharp disparities, even within the population you're talking about. So the question here is, what kind of challenge does internet access and technological literacy pose in online data for older adults, particularly those 65 or older? And I would say that in Singapore, 65 is not considered particularly old, by the way.
Yeah. But so it's a real challenge actually. So about 20% of people in the SAP don't participate in the survey on their own. So many older individuals who don't know how to use the internet or don't have internet access, they just we call them or they call us so that they can do a telephone interview. But there are times we want to do some kind of interactive survey using the computer feature of the survey. In that case, many, children have their parents actually doing this survey, by the way. I just want to emphasize that, because in Singapore, it's a lot more common for children to live together with their parents. So many children actually have them. And we also take the advantage of being a city state in the sense that we dispatch our student assistants to the local library, and we invite our elderly participants to come there and have them do the internet survey together with student assistants. So that way we try to overcome the technical challenge.
Yeah, and I would say that in Singapore, actually, again, we have the advantage of being a very small country. So you can chase people quite a long way and get them into a community library where that's also a little bit of a norm. We have digital ambassadors for older adults as well, I think, because it is widely recognized that this digital divide is important, not just for this kind of thing, but really for digital finance and other sorts of applications. And the fact that Singapore uses digital means now to do quite a lot of our COVID-related and other kind of monitoring. So for us, I think this is a wider issue, but definitely it's the case that even in a country that tries and puts a lot of resources into it, it's a challenge. Alex, would you say something about it? Perhaps you don't have an older adult focused panel, but if you could say a little bit more, perhaps about your panel in general and whether or not this is an issue, that would be great.
Yeah. I think it is an issue for us. So our panel was not derived through probability sampling like with the SMU panel. And although it looks fairly like the population in terms of things like the age profile and the racial breakdown and so on, but I do think that it's probably skewed towards English speakers, for example, and probably therefore also slightly higher socioeconomic status. In a way that's partly by design, because we field the surveys in English. Otherwise, we have to write 4 different versions of every survey, and that's going to be a pain in a multilingual country. But it does mean that there is always a little bit of a fear that we're missing out on some important groups in the population, especially amongst the older adults for whom they may not speak English, may not even speak Mandarin, they might speak dialect, for example.
Great. And maybe if I could actually then just pick up, I think, on something that Seong-Hun had mentioned, which he is trying to build into his panel, which is biomarker collection. So at this moment, I mean, given that our panel that we're talking about right now lives at the School of Public Health, do you have a biomarker collection activity attached to the panel, or is that something that you're planning, or not necessarily?
Sorry.
I'll go first. Okay, so our School of Public Health has quite a few established cohort studies which do have biomarker specimens being taken. However, they're incredibly valuable to our school, and so therefore touching them too often to ask them survey questions doesn't go down so well with the epidemiologists who really want to preserve the integrity of their cohort as much as they can. So for us, we find that trying to get both the biospecimens together with the ability to ping them with frequent surveys, it's not possible to get both of them. So that we decided to rule that out quite early on. So it'll be very interesting to see how SMU is able to do it, because of course getting the biomarkers and so on is expensive.
Yeah, that's right. Seong-Hun, sorry, can I pass that back to you?
No, so I was just going to say that I hope that we can do this, but we are not currently planning, but this is one of the future agenda. It's a kind of big homework we want to solve. But if I ask participants, through our focus group studies, we, again, being a city-state allows us to do a lot of localized events with study participants, actually. So we ask them around, they are very happy and enthusiastic to participate in such a extended survey module. So we hope that we can do this, but I'm not so sure whether we can do this in any time near future, because Joanne, you would know that SMU doesn't have a medical school, so it's a little bit difficult to pass the IIB and so on. So we see.
That's right. But sometimes I think then that makes us very brave, which is sometimes a good thing, actually. And to sort of tie this back to Singapore's policies, we do have very comprehensive, for example, national health screening programs that encourage the population to take up health screening at regular points. And so perhaps even sort of having some connection with the national health screening records and the EMRs at some point in time, if that can be done, would also be extremely, extremely, extremely valuable. Okay, we have time for one last question. If there are any from the floor, I think we are due to move on from the session at 11:05. And if there are any other further questions from the floor, I will take them. And if not, I will ask one of my, there was someone and then they went away. Okay, well, too bad. In that case, then the time is mine. And what I'd like to actually ask is for the panels that you have now, and Seung-hoon, I think, the SLP is fairly large and it's established and it's rolling on. And Alex, this is a panel that is a little bit more focused on public health. But my sense is that both of these panels, just from a structural point of view, required a fair amount of investment upfront to get this running, right? The infrastructure to mobilize this, I mean, both of these really was not small at all. And as Ari has mentioned, I think in the United States, for example, there is a lot of emphasis on making that data public. But now even in Singapore, to do that, we have a lot of concern about protecting data, making sure that confidentiality is assured. And so making data public is quite challenging. So given that this is such an effort to set up these things and sort of make these panels go, how do you envision, and maybe I can ask this both of you this, when you mentioned that funding has been sort of extended for the panel, how do you see use of this panel sort of for academic versus policy research? How do you balance that, or how do you sustain a momentum on a panel like this? I mean, you're doing monthly surveys every month with 80 waves on all of these people. How do you see sort of like the use of this panel for research between policy, academia, and then potentially even private sector use?
So that's a big concern, actually. When I think about Dr. Ketin, I cannot imagine how he can do that for the last 30 years. Renewing the funding is the biggest, worry that I have regarding the SLP. So the government is the major source of the funding. So we try to balance that very well. We need to find the sweet spot between policy research and academic research. So, but naturally, using the SLP data, we do a lot of policy research. So I myself, one nice thing about the SLP, if you think about it, the Singapore government doesn't allow researchers to have access to academic data for research, unlike other European countries and so on. So we don't really do much regression discontinuity type research. But if you have 8,000 people participating in a survey every month, you can quickly get a lot of observations that allow you to do high precision research that can, with the regression discontinuity design, type research. So we do a lot of RDD to do a lot of pilot research. It turns out that the government really likes it. And during the COVID-19, our survey was very unique in the sense that we can keep track of monthly changes in major life outcomes during the COVID-19 period. And our research went directly to the Prime Minister's office so that they can incorporate what we know into their policy or designs with regard to the COVID-19 policies. So I think that we have a very strong collaboration with the government, but that can be also, but our research is mainly academic. But what I want to say is that we do academic research, we focus on it, but we naturally have a strong policy implication. So I think that so far we didn't really try to do something, but are on the kind of the natural sweet spot of that trade-off, I would say.
Okay, great.
I hope that they can also help get funding in the future.
Well, we hope so too. And it does sort of speak though to that need for the panel. Once you start it up, unfortunately, then that momentum needs to keep going because you do need to keep engaging those panelists without exhausting them by touching them too often, physically or otherwise, Alex. Alex, maybe I can turn back to you, and if you'd say a little bit about that, or we don't have a huge amount of time, but it would be great to just hear about your plans for this panel, how we plan to sustain it, how you think it works with the rest of the research agenda that we have at SPH.
Well, I'm very sad because our funding got killed off.
No.
So our panel dies this year. But moving away from just from the funding aspect, that's always an issue with grants, is about access to data. I find that the Singapore government tends to be a little bit schizophrenic sometimes when it comes to some of its policies. On the one hand, the funders always say, oh yeah, we want open data, we want to reap the full rewards of the studies that we're paying for. But on the other side, they say, oh yeah, but data about individuals, you can't be sharing that. That would be quite dangerous and so on. So the kind of the workaround that we're moving towards is to allow other parties to access your data through like a kind of a shared platform, which would prohibit them from taking it out and like putting on the internet or whatever, but would still allow them to do the kinds of analyses that they would want to be able to do. They haven't quite got this established yet. I think it will be coming later this year, not in time for my panel because it'll be dead by then, but maybe in time for me to get access to the SMU panel.
Oh, well,
So if I just add a little bit, so far the SAP is not fully publicly open. So we use that fact to negotiate with the government to get access to their admin data. So the government wants to have access to our data. So we try to negotiate with them. If you want our data, you need to give us something. So that's what we are doing with the public, Social Security Administration of Singapore, like called the CPM.
That is a very interesting strategy, something for all of us to learn about, I think. All right, well, thank you so much, Alex, Young-Hun, Joel. It's been a pleasure to speak with everybody today again. We are so happy to come to all of you here on the wide world of the internet, all the way from Singapore. Thank you, 3 of you, for staying up so late. I hope we will be hearing lots from the audience about people who would like to collaborate with our Singaporean colleagues. And I'll pass that back to Tara and Ari.